There is a town in Western Australia that the government spent years trying to erase. Not abandon, erase. They painted its name off the road signs, pulled it from the official state map, and cut the power on purpose because simply breathing the air there was killing people, and had been for decades. That town is still standing, illegal to enter, and it's the reason this list exists. Stay with us, because number one today is unlike anything we've ever covered. And once you hear what happened there, you'll understand why some places don't just get abandoned, they get buried by their own country. Australia has more empty land than almost anywhere on Earth, and scattered across it are towns that once had banks, hotels, breweries, and thousands of residents chasing gold, silver, copper, or a railway paycheck. Most of those towns are gone now. Some are locked behind heritage protection, land you can visit but never own. Others sit right next to some of the cheapest real estate on the continent, houses selling for less than a used car in a country where the average home costs over $500,000. Today, we're counting down 10 of them, from a Nullarbor railway stop nobody owns to a gold town once run by a future American president, all the way to the darkest chapter in Australian mining history. Some of these you can actually buy into right now. Others you can only walk through and wonder. Either way, you'll understand why the Outback keeps more secrets than any city ever could. Let's start at number 10. Number 10, Cook, South Australia. If you want to see just how empty Australia can get, ride the Indian Pacific train across the Nullarbor Plain, the largest single slab of limestone bedrock on the planet. Somewhere in the middle of that nothing, the train stops at a town called Cook. It was built in 1917 to service the Trans-Australian Railway, named after Sir Joseph Cook, Australia's 6th Prime Minister. In its working years, it had a school, a hospital run by the Bush Church Aid Society, a bank, and a 2-cell jail with matching his and hers holding cells for anyone caught wandering the line. At its peak, around 50 people called Cook home, all there to keep steam trains running across the longest dead straight stretch of railway on Earth, 478 kilometers without a single bend. Then, in 1997, the railway was privatized. The new owners didn't need a support town anymore, and almost everyone left within months. Today, Cook has a population you can count on one hand, kept alive only because trains still need to refuel and drivers still need somewhere to sleep between shifts. You cannot buy property here. It sits on Rail Corporation land, not open market land. But it sets the tone for this whole list, because if a town this essential to the railway could fall to 4 residents in months, imagine what happened to towns with nothing propping them up at all. That brings us to number 9, and this one still has a heartbeat, just not the kind you'd expect. Number 9, Farina, South Australia. The name is Latin for flower, chosen on purpose. In 1878, settlers looked at the arid land 600 kilometers north of Adelaide, caught an unusually wet season, and convinced themselves this red dirt could become a great wheat-growing region. For a few years, it almost worked. Farina grew to a few hundred people, with 2 hotels, 2 breweries, a bank, a school, and according to local accounts, a brothel. Then the drought came, the kind that doesn't break, and the farming fantasy collapsed with it. The population drained out through the early 20th century until the town was fully abandoned by the 1980s. What makes Farina different is what's buried beneath it. In the 1880s, a meat store was converted into an underground bakery, dug into the earth to survive the heat, complete with a wood-fired Scotch oven. For most of the year, Farina is silent stone ruins and dust. But since 2009, a volunteer group called the Farina Restoration Group has returned each winter to fire that oven back up, baking bread out of a bakery buried in a ghost town, just for a few weeks before the silence returns. You cannot buy a block here. The town site sits within a working pastoral station, but a town built on false hope and killed by drought sets up something you'll see again on this list. Number 8 takes that same story and burns through a fortune in under a decade. Number 8, Kuridala, Queensland. Copper was discovered here in 1884, 65 kilometers south of Cloncurry. The town was originally called Gulatin, but wartime paranoia during the First World War made that name sound too German for comfort, so it was renamed Kuridala, an Aboriginal word for eaglehawk. By 1920, the smelter chimneys that still dominate the landscape today were processing tens of thousands of tons of copper ore a year, and the population had climbed past 2,000 with 6 hotels, ice works, and its own rail spur. Then copper prices collapsed after the war, banks pulled financing, and the company was delisted from the stock exchange within a decade. Population dropped to 800 by 1924, and the slide never reversed. All that survives today is the smelter's brick chimneys, scattered foundations, and a cemetery with 30 marked headstones and over 150 unmarked graves. It's heritage listed, protected, but not for sale, though nearby Cloncurry has some of the cheapest housing in Queensland, with basic homes listed well under $100,000. Kuridala rose and fell inside a single decade. Number 7 took almost twice as long to die, but the end was final in a way nothing else here can match. And speaking of final endings, if you're the kind of person who actually finishes videos like this instead of clicking away at the first ad break, you already know this channel goes deeper than the average ghost town countdown. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from, because we read everyone. And it's wild seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we post a new deep dive every single week. So hit that button now, because number 1 today might be the heaviest thing we've ever covered. Number 7, Walhalla, Victoria. Tucked into a narrow Gippsland valley, Walhalla was born in December 1862 when a prospector named Edward Stringer found gold along a creek that would bear his name. Stringer never got to enjoy what he started. He died of illness just weeks after the discovery. What followed was one of the richest goldfields in Victorian history, the Long Tunnel. Extended mine pulled out a fortune, and Walhalla's population swelled past 4,000, crammed onto a valley floor so narrow that houses were stacked up the hillsides like nests. In 1884, Walhalla briefly had electric street lighting, a genuine world first for a town this size powered by the mine itself. But the isolation that made Walhalla feel like its own hidden kingdom also doomed it. There was no real road out until 1878 and no railway until 1910, by which point the richest gold was already gone, and the mines were spending more to pump water out of their shafts than they made selling ore. The Long Tunnel extended closed in 1911. Population that had topped 4,000 fell to 200 by 1920 and under 20 by the 1960s. Local historians tell of a miner named Richard Dunn, buried in Walhalla's cemetery, who died at 55 from what was then called miner's lung, having fathered 15 children and buried 11 of them before he went. That cemetery today holds more than 1,200 graves above a town with fewer than 20 full-time residents. Walhalla didn't connect to Victoria's power grid until December 1998, the last town in the entire state to get it, over a century after its own mine-powered lights had gone dark. A handful of properties do occasionally come up for sale, mostly as weekend retreats, since the valley stays as isolated today as it was in Stringer's time. Number 6 trades gold for something rarer, and it comes with houses you can genuinely still buy today. Number 6. Coober, Pedy, South Australia. Out on the Stuart Highway, 846 kilometers north of Adelaide. Temperatures regularly climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. Early opal miners figured out something practical fast. Instead of fighting that heat, go underground and let the earth regulate it for you. That's how Coober, Pedy became known for its dugouts, entire homes carved directly into sandstone hillsides, staying comfortable year-round without air conditioning. Opal was discovered here in 1915, and the town never had the population booms of the gold rush towns further east. It stayed small, isolated, and strange, a place where a startling share of the housing stock is literally underground. Today, Coober, Pedy has one of the most unusual real estate markets in the country. Above-ground houses have listed for well under $100,000, and dugout properties have sold for even less, with one listing dropping as low as $25,000 for a home that never needs a window air conditioner to survive summer. It's not a classic abandoned ghost town. It's a living town that never grew the way it was supposed to, and the strangeness of its architecture is the whole reason it stayed small. If Coober, Pedy shows what happens when people adapt to the landscape, number 5 shows what happens when Hollywood decides your ghost town is exactly the wasteland it's been looking for. Number 5. Silverton, New South Wales. In the early 1880s, silver, lead, and zinc were discovered in far west New South Wales, and Silverton exploded almost overnight, reaching roughly 3,000 people by the late 1880s, complete with its own camel-drawn tramway toward the South Australian border. Then, an even richer deposit was found 26 kilometers away in a place called Broken Hill, and the entire town emptied out almost as fast as it had filled up. By 1901, fewer than 300 people remained, and some residents literally dismantled their houses and carted them to Broken Hill piece by piece. What saved Silverton from disappearing completely was its landscape. The flat, red, end-of-the-world scenery has attracted filmmakers for decades, most famously George Miller, who shot Mad Max 2 in and around the town in 1981, turning the local pub into an accidental movie landmark and giving Silverton its own Mad Max museum. More than 40 films and countless commercials have used Silverton's dust and emptiness as a stand-in for the apocalypse. Today, the permanent population hovers around 50, mostly artists, but it draws well over 100,000 tourists a year. You can't buy much inside Silverton's tiny historic core, but the surrounding Broken Hill region, the town that stole Silverton's future, now has some of the cheapest real estate in the country, with a median house value around $266,000 and individual homes selling for as little as $33,000. Silverton proves a ghost town doesn't need people to have a second act. Number 4 needed just one person, and that person went on to run an entire country. Number 4, Gwalia, Western Australia. In 1896, 3 prospectors found a gold reef near Mount Leonora and named their claim Sons of Gwalia, an old poetic name for Wales. The mine was purchased by a London firm the following year, and to manage it, that firm sent out a 23-year-old American mining engineer with almost no track record. His name was Herbert Hoover. Hoover ran Sons of Gwalia from 1898, cutting costs and reshaping the operation before leaving for mining ventures in China less than a year later. He would go on more than 3 decades afterward to become the 31st President of the United States. The house he designed for the mine manager still stands on the hill above the town site, now a bed and breakfast carrying his name. Under his leadership and the decades that followed, Sons of Gwalia became one of the richest gold mines in Australian history, and the town grew to somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 residents, many of them Italian and Yugoslav immigrants who built homes from corrugated iron and Hessian sacking within walking distance of the shaft. Then, on December 21, 1963, the mine closed. Trains were sent up from Kalgoorlie, and residents were told to take only what they could carry. Within about 3 weeks, a town of well over 1,000 fell to roughly 40 residents, and it has stayed a near ghost town ever since. Preserved today as a heritage museum with more than 20 original buildings standing. You can't simply buy a house here. It's protected heritage land under the Shire of Leonora. But the mine reopened in 1983 and today runs as the deepest trucking mine in the world, still pulling gold from the ground Herbert Hoover once managed with no idea what he'd become. Number 3 has no famous name attached to it. It has something rarer, a claim to being the single largest ghost town in the country. Number 3, Kanowna, Western Australia. Originally known as White Feather, gold was found here in 1893, 20 kilometers northeast of Kalgoorlie, and what followed was one of the most explosive population booms in Australian mining history. In 1897, roughly 2,500 people lived in Kanowna. By 1899, that number had rocketed past 12,000, complete with 16 hotels, 2 breweries, and an hourly train service running the short distance into Kalgoorlie. Tourism Western Australia itself describes Kanowna as, in its own words, perhaps the most incredible of all Australian ghost towns, and it's often credited as the largest one in the country by peak population. In 1898, the gold fever here reached a genuinely strange peak. Rumors spread of a massive alluvial gold nugget worth an enormous fortune, and an estimated 7,000 people, some rushing over specifically from Kalgoorlie, gathered outside a local hotel demanding to know its exact location. The whole thing turned out to be an elaborate hoax, scrap iron painted gold, but by the time the truth came out, the town had already proven just how much raw hunger for gold it could summon in a single afternoon. 2 years later, in 1900, gold was struck directly inside Kanowna's own cemetery, prompting something called cemetery leases, where existing graves had to be relocated to make way for new digging. As the easily accessible alluvial gold ran dry, Kanowna's population went into freefall. By 1953, the town was fully abandoned. Today, virtually nothing remains standing, just building foundations, a relocated cemetery, and interpretive signage along the Kanowna Heritage Trail, walked now by a population that officially numbers around 10 people. Kanowna sits on Crown land, so this is another entry you can explore but never purchase. Number 2 is where this list stops being about history and starts being about a real number you could act on today. We're down to our final 2, and the gap between them is the whole reason this list exists in the first place. Number 2 shows you the cheapest, real, livable house price in the entire country, verified and current. Number 1 shows you what happens when a town becomes so dangerous that the government itself decides it has to disappear. If you've made it this far, you already know this one's going to hit different. Subscribe if you haven't already, and get ready, because what's coming next isn't really about houses anymore. Number 2, Kambalda West, Western Australia. According to property data released by realestate.com.au's PropTrack division, Kambalda West currently holds the title of the single cheapest suburb to buy a house in the entirety of Australia. It sits about 60 kilometers south of Kalgoorlie, built up as a nickel mining town in the 1960s after major nickel deposits were discovered in the area. A boom that briefly turned this stretch of the goldfields into one of the most important mining zones in the country. Kambalda West never fully emptied out the way the classic gold rush ghost towns did. It still functions as a working town today, supporting ongoing nickel operations in the region. but its population has shrunk well below what the original town site was built for, and the property market reflects it in a way almost nowhere else in Australia does. The median house price in Kambalda West sits at roughly $226,000. And that's just the median. Individual homes have sold for significantly less than that figure in a country where the national median house price sits well north of $500,000. That means a family home in Kambalda West can cost less than a fifth of what the same style of house would run in Sydney or Melbourne. It's real, livable housing stock, not abandoned ruins, in a functioning town with services, a school, and a genuine community. Just one that most of the country has never heard of, and even fewer have ever visited. If you've ever wondered whether Australia actually has towns where a full house costs less than a new car, Kambalda West is your proof, and it's happening right now. Not in some archived listing from a decade ago. But real estate bargains only tell half the story of what this country has built and abandoned. Number one isn't about a bargain at all. It's about what happens when a town's entire existence has to be erased for the safety of everyone who might otherwise wander in. Number one, Wittenoom, Western Australia. In the late 1930s, mining began in the gorges of the Hamersley Range in the remote Pilbara region, over 1,100 kilometers north of Perth. The target was blue asbestos, also known as crucidalite, a heat-resistant mineral used across the country in building materials, insulation, and industrial products. The Wittenoom mine ramped up through the 1940s and became, for years, Australia's only domestic supplier of blue asbestos, shipping an estimated 161,000 tons of the material out of the gorge between 1943 and 1966. A company town grew up around the mine, and at its peak in the 1950s, Wittenoom held a population of around 2,000 residents, with an estimated 20,000 people passing through as workers or family members across the operation's full lifespan. What almost nobody in Wittenoom understood at the time was that the fibers in the air around them, and in the asbestos tailings used to pave the town's own streets, were quietly destroying people's lungs. A government medical officer named Dr. Eric Saint raised early warnings about dust levels in the mine, but for years those warnings went largely unheeded by both the mining company and government authorities, more concerned with the town's economic output than its air quality. Mining operations wound down through the 1960s as the medical evidence became harder to ignore. But by then, the damage inside thousands of pairs of lungs had already been done, and it wouldn't show up for years, sometimes decades, in the form of asbestosis and mesothelioma. More than 2,000 former residents and workers have died from asbestos-related disease connected to Wittenoom, and the death toll has continued climbing for decades after the mine itself stopped operating, because that's how these diseases work. They wait. In December 2006, the state government announced that Wittenoom had lost its official status altogether. It was removed from road signs and government maps the following year, a genuine, deliberate act of erasing a populated place from official cartography in an attempt to stop people from visiting a site now classified as the largest contaminated location in the Southern Hemisphere. A small number of residents refused to leave for years afterward, but in 2015, legislation was passed to forcibly remove the last of them. After a bushfire destroyed most of the town's remaining structures in late 2022, demolition of what was left began in 2023, and today, Wittenoom exists almost entirely as warning signs, restricted roads, and a cemetery that authorities have promised, so far without much detail, to keep accessible for the families who still have loved ones buried there. You cannot buy property in Wittenoom. you are not legally permitted to enter Wittenoom at all. It is, quite simply, the only entry on this list that the Australian government has actively tried to make disappear. Not because the history wasn't worth remembering, but because remembering it in person could still cost you your life. 10 towns, and not one of them tells the same story twice. A railway stop nobody owns. A bakery that comes back to life for 8 weeks a year. A copper boom town renamed out of wartime paranoia. A valley that lit its streets before most of the state had electricity, then waited over a century for the grid to catch up. Houses carved into solid rock to beat the heat. A silver town saved by a post-apocalyptic movie franchise. A future American president who spent less than a year in a town most Australians have never heard of. The largest ghost town in the country, undone by its own gold rush. The single cheapest house price in the entire nation, sitting quietly in a working mining town most people will never visit, and a place so dangerous that the government erased it from the map rather than let people keep walking in. That's the real story behind Australia's cheap real estate and its emptiest towns. It was never really about the price of a house. It's about what a country decides to remember, what it tries to forget, and what it has no choice but to keep paying for. Sometimes, literally, decades later. If this list surprised you, let us know in the comments which town you'd actually consider visiting, and which one you'd stay far away from. Subscribe if you want more of these deep dives into the places the map tries to leave behind. We'll see you in the next one.